Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor as I have every week.
Quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. President. I've come to the floor every week for the past several months to draw attention to a matter that I think should be important to anybody who travels overseas, anybody who does missionary work, anybody that could go to a country and potentially detain you for false charges and imprison you for nearly 2 years. I'm talking about a Presbyterian minister from North Carolina who has been in Turkey for the better part of 2 years, or he's been in Turkey for the better part of 20 years. And he was a missionary that entire time. He created a church in Izmir and has lived there peacefully and lawfully for 2 decades. But in October of 2016, after the coup attempt, an illegal coup attempt, and the people responsible for it should actually have to answer to the Turkish justice system, swept Pastor Brunson and thousands of other people into the Turkish justice system, and he's been in prison since 2016. He was in prison for nearly 19 months before he was ever charged with anything. And in fact, he lost 50 pounds over the course of about a year. He was in a cell that was designed for 8 people that had 21 people in it. I don't believe any of the others even spoke English. He was then transferred to another prison where he was kept in a cell with one other person, given virtually no access to the outside world. He's experienced medical challenges, as anyone would expect when you're in prison without charges, and the charges that we found out were bogus. That would weigh on you mentally. We started working to try to first let Pastor Brunson know that we knew about him and that I, as the senator from North Carolina, cared about him. I cared enough to go to Turkey to visit him in prison several months ago. And I told him I wanted to face-to-face assure him that as long as he's in prison, I will be working for his release. As a matter of fact, we have more than 70 senators who have signed on to a letter who share my concern that he's illegally in prison. So now what have we done? We've actually put a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act that holds Turkey accountable. They're a partner in developing the Joint Strike Fighter. It's a capability that I sincerely hope someday that Turkey may have. But there's no way on earth that we should transfer that technology to Turkey as long as they're illegally imprisoning Pastor Brunson and others that I'll talk about shortly. We did make some positive progress a few weeks ago. After he'd been in prison for nearly 20 months, a little over, he was released on house arrest. So at least he is now in his apartment near Izmir. He's got an ankle bracelet on, and he's not allowed to get out of his house. He's had several hearings. I actually attended one back earlier in the spring, and I was in that courtroom for almost 12 hours. And I heard some of the most absurd claims you could ever allege as a basis for keeping somebody in prison overnight, let alone 2 years in October. So we're working with the administration, and I want to give the President a lot of credit for making this a priority. If you've read the newspapers recently, it'd be hard for you not to hear about the Presbyterian minister, Pastor Brunson, and the difference of opinion between Turkey and the United States on what should be done. Now, when I talk to a lot of the Turkish officials, they say, well, you've got to respect our justice system. This just has to play out, no matter how absurd the claims may be. That's my words, not theirs. And I really wonder if they're sincere. And here's why. Several months ago, President Erdogan, the president of Turkey, made a public statement saying, how about this? We'll give you your pastor if you give us our pastor. There's a person living here in the United States named Gulen who they believe may have had something to do with the coup. What we said is honor, we have an extradition treaty with Turkey. We said honor the requirements of the extradition treaty, present credible evidence that Gulen is guilty of having conspired in the illegal coup, and then we'll let our process take its course. But let me tell you what's interesting about even making that offer in the context of the other elected officials, including Erdogan, saying we just have to let our legal process play out. How on the one hand can you say your hands are tied, but on the other hand, make a hostage swap request, or what they would consider to be a hostage swap request. Okay, so maybe you just misspoke. Presidents do that from time to time. But now let's take a look at what we're dealing with now. A week ago, instead of offering Pastor Brunson for Mr. Gulen, now there's a new exchange on the table. If we drop a case against a Turkish bank, which has risen to our level of jurisprudence, the allegations against them, so they're going to have to go through the legal process. Apparently, their judicial system does allow you to say, well, if you drop that case in the gold standard for judicial systems, that's the U.S. judicial system, then we'll release Pastor Brunson. Clearly, Turkey has the authority to release Pastor Brunson. Turkey has the authority to release a NASA scientist who happened to be visiting his family, who's been in prison for almost 3 years now and has a 7-year sentence or another 4.5 years ahead of him. They have the authority to release him. The only thing he seems to be guilty of is having been in Turkey visiting relatives when the coup attempt occurred. They have the authority to release a DEA agent that they said was involved in the coup attempt. They have the authority to release a number of Turkish nationals who have worked with our embassy for years, and all they were doing was their job, but they got swept up, as thousands more have. So, Mr. President, thank you again for the opportunity for me to come to the floor and make sure that the American people understand what's at stake. Turkey is a NATO ally. No NATO ally in the history of the alliance has ever illegally detained a citizen from one of their partner countries. But that's exactly what's happened here since October of 2016. So I hope that this is the last time that I have to come to this floor to talk about releasing Pastor Brunson. I hope next week I'm coming to the floor thanking the Turkish leadership for doing the right thing, thanking them for letting Pastor Brunson and his wife Noreen come back to the United States, and advocating for a great relationship with Turkey as a NATO partner that's very important, but none of that can happen as long as Pastor Brunson and the others that I've mentioned are illegally in prison. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. And I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk